Welcome everyone to episode 3 of Museum People. Today I'd like to welcome Warren Maye to our show. Warren is the editor-in-chief of our Salvation Army Communications Department, and he's responsible for the publishing of our SA Connects magazine, among other things. He is a journalist, he is an editor, he's an historian who's worked for the Salvation Army for 40 years. 40 years, Warren. That's a long time. He's also an author, which is the main reason he's talking to me today. He wrote the wonderful book, Soldiers of Uncommon Valor, a History of Salvationists of African Descent in the United States, published by Others Press. Warren, welcome. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. Appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you. So, Warren, your book was published back in 2008, and if my math is correct, that's 13 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And think back to those days, and probably a couple of years before that, when you were actually in the process of writing. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was published in 2008, but it was actually conceived way back in the 1990s. When Major Norma T. Roberts wrote the first attempt at this. It was called The Black Salvationists, and she was inspiring. It was only 75 pages long, and it was missing many of the stories that we later uncovered, but nonetheless, it was quite an inspiration to me and to many others, soldiers, employees, officers, and supporters of the Salvation Army. And in the midst of that, I was serving at national headquarters. I was there for 10 years, working on the War Cry magazine as editor and art director. And during that process of developing the magazine from a two-color to a full-color publication as it is today, I came across many great short stories, vignettes about people of color, in the Salvation Army. And I thought, wouldn't it be great, wouldn't it be grand if we could publish them all, between the covers of just one book.
Right.
And so as I was working along, I would come across some more stories, and as I discovered them, I'd file them away. And I later discovered that Daniel Conley, he's now a retired officer, and then Major Alan Wilshire, who's also retired, they were actually working on similar projects. They were working on the same thing, just filing away stories. And we got together and we started to just talk and encourage each other and share. And so then later in the year 2000, we realized that, this time had come. This dream had to come to fruition at this point where, working on our spare time, we were going to create a book. And that's when it took actually 8 years for it to come to fruition. But we did the research, and I actually wrote the book. And by 2008, as you said, we published it. And we went to press, and it was well received. It was very much enthusiastically received and endorsed by, Army leaders and officers and soldiers. And so, I'm truly grateful to have had a part in that, and really appreciative of the reception that we got.
Wonderful. And I got to say, since taking over the position of museum director here, your book is one of my top essay historical reference books I keep near me when I'm doing research or when I want to answer a question about an African American Salvationist or personality. So it's kind of cool to be able to chat with you about your book and learn something about how it came into fruition.
Thanks.
In all the research that you did, I'm sure, over the years, do you have a favorite African American Salvationist from our history that you say, this is kind of my favorite personality, or this is someone I really respect and identify with?
Well, that's a hard question because there were so many people that were just so inspiring, so many soldiers of uncommon valor that I came across. But, I have to say that Lieutenant Colonels Abraham and Louise Johnson, the two of them stand out in my mind. I've known them for 30 years.
Right.
And,
Right.
it's one thing to write about someone out of history. It's another thing to actually know the person and to know that you're really writing about firsthand experience.
Right.
And that was an inspiration to me. I saw them in Harlem, working at the Harlem Temple Corps on both locations. I saw them in Cleveland and Brooklyn, and they were just a great encouragement to me and my wife, and we really appreciated them. And most recently, they were honored with the Order of the Founder, which is the highest honor the Salvation Army bestows on any officer. And it was at the recent commissioning, and the Commissioner's Bamford presented it only because the general couldn't be there because of this COVID-19 restriction. But it was a beautiful ceremony, and it was great to see them honored in that way. So I'd have to say it's the Johnsons.
Wonderful. That's a good pick. I mean, couldn't do any better. One of the things, Warren, I love about your book, in each chapter, you include an amazing backdrop of what was going on in America concerning African Americans. From colonial times, you touch on that, the Civil War era, right up into the 1960s, the Civil Rights era, and right up until, the more contemporary history of today. A lot of Salvation Army books aren't really like that. They tell the story of the Salvation Army or a character in the Salvation Army, but they don't really go much into the history that surrounds it. Why was it important for you to write about the socio-historic background in a book about Black Salvationists?
Well, that was one of the things that intrigued me and actually excited me to see the direct connection that the Salvation Army's history had with the outside world and vice versa. Because I believe history really comes alive when one can put it into context of an ongoing conversation. I think of studying history as a conversation that you're getting into. You're getting into this conversation of answering the question, what's going on? Marvin Gaye had a song years ago called "What's Going On?"
Right.
And people are still asking that question. So, as individuals, we're born historians from the moment we open our eyes when we come out of our mother's womb. We want to know what's going on. Who are these people? Who am I? Where am I? What am I supposed to be doing? And as we continue to answer those questions, the answers only come from learning the history, learning who our mother and father is and who they were, learning about our family history. All that gives us a sense of understanding and meaning in terms of who we are as a person and who we should be going forward in life. So it's not just about looking at the past, it's about preparing ourselves for the future. And then that process of understanding the past, understanding the future, getting a sense of what the patterns are in history, we get a sense of confidence about going forward because we can learn to anticipate things that are going to happen. Maybe not perfectly, we're not, but we have a sense of confidence that we know what's happening, what's going on. And I believe that when you take these important issues and events and circumstances and circumscribe them around a particular story, a vignette about someone in the Salvation Army, from colonial times, like you said, to the Civil War, to the Civil Rights era, right up into the day. These milestones that deeply influence the Salvation Army shows how it also deeply influences the African American community and vice versa. So, like for example, one of the things that was really exciting to me was actually a fascinating connection was between the Salvation Army's ministry, the Civil War, and actually what's currently happening in our world, in our country in particular, today.
Right.
Back in those days, William Booth had these proteges. James Jeremy, I write about him in the first chapter. George Scott Railton, who came along after, and then Eliza Shirley. And they all came to the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War, a time when this country had been torn apart politically and even spiritually. And to them, this country was a mission field,
Right.
full of souls ripe for the harvest. And their intent was to help heal this nation and to bring reconciliation to all of the people, white, black, whatever. And that was their mission when they came here. And to understand this in this kind of context makes it easier for us to understand why we should care anything about it, why it's important, why this history should be understood, even as it repeats itself today. And that's why I wanted to make those connections and put those stories in there so we could see how they work together next to each other. I don't believe there's a black history or a white history or American history or European history. There is just history.
True.
And none of it could happen without the other.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Very true. I'd say you touched on this a bit in your last answer, but if you could release a 2021 revised version of your book, what are some topics or areas of research you might expand on?
Well, I tell you, I would definitely include the Army's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, look at how it's disproportionately affected people of color in this country. And even now with the vaccinations, you can see that the history of America has influenced how people trust the whole system of even getting a vaccination. So you have a large majority of white people who have actually gone and gotten it, but an unbelievable, surprising number of black people who are still reticent, who are waiting, who are not really sure that they should take this on.
Right.
And that's because of the history.
Right.
Because of the history. So that's something I would definitely deal with. And to see the Army go into communities of color and deliver food in the midst of COVID all across the country, nobody else is doing it like that. Nobody else, no other church has taken that on to the extent like the Salvation Army has. And that would have to be in any rewrite or any further editions of this book. And then I would also want to deal with the social unrest that we've had. Look at the murder of George Floyd and how this man who was a former Salvation Army employee, life was taken and sparked a global uprising of people who were saying enough is enough.
Right.
So something like that would have to go in there. And then I look at the young officers who are rising up, who are walking in the footsteps of people like Commissioners Gaith or the Lieutenant Colonels Edwards, Lieutenant Colonels Johnson, who are aspiring to fill those big shoes. And I think talking about that, the future of the Army and the future of the Salvation Army in the African American community would be some things that I would want to deal with. There's some great challenges facing the Salvation Army and the world, and they're influencing the way we minister in communities, particularly in communities of color, and how we respond, especially in this age of political and social unrest, how we're responding because of social media, and anti-social media that's out there.
Right, right.
You know, it largely affects how we witness to the world. And so those are some of the things I would love to cover in an additional book.
Right. Well, that would be a fascinating book. So I hope you're able to, if it's not in the form of a book, at least through your articles and the pages of SA Connect. So we all look forward to reading that, Warren. Warren, I would be delighted if you would close our interview today by reading a selection from your book, Soldiers of Uncommon Valor, The History of Salvationists of African Descent in the United States. And so, Mr. Maye, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Rob, for inviting me to participate as one of your museum people and in this series. And it's been a delightful time with you. So what I want to do is read from the end of chapter 2, which is entitled, My Lord, What a Morning, starting at page 29. And it basically describes the inauguration of the Salvation Army in the United States when George Scott Railton and Elijah Shirley met in Philadelphia in 1880. So it says, time would reveal Railton's prophetic vision to be true. Some brave and daring white officers would be willing to make the commitment despite the social consequences that came with it. After the landing, news reporters from the New York Times and other local papers interviewed Railton, who commenced the Army's first official public relations campaign by telling them about the organization's origin, purpose, and projects. He also gave them comprehensive statistics printed on flyers, listing numbers of officers, services, both indoors and outdoors, people in attendance, and souls saved. In their articles, the reporters pointed out that African Americans were present at the meeting. Artists included them in renderings of the scene. Unfortunately, the reporters also used derogatory adjectives to describe the crowd. Their choice of words reflected the classism and racism of the day. One reporter wrote, quote, a more motley, vice-smitten, pestilence-breeding congregation could seldom be found in a house of worship. There were Negroes, dancing girls, prostitutes, and station house tramps sandwiched in between well-dressed visitors, unquote. Although Railton had planned to locate the Army's national headquarters in New York City, local ordinances on street preaching and public assembly restricted such privileges to clergy of already established denominations. To his dismay, Railton was prohibited from holding mass open-air meetings. So he headed for Philadelphia, where the Shirleys had conducted their breakthrough open-air meeting just 6 months before. It was a historic moment for the Salvation Army in the United States when Railton's contingent met Eliza Shirley's followers in Philadelphia on March 24, 1880. They held a special public meeting so that Railton could formally present the Army flag sent by Catherine Booth to Amos, Annie, and Eliza Shirley. Railton was amazed by the crowd size. Quote, it was the biggest meeting of my life, unquote, he later wrote. More than 200 soldiers wearing Army hatbands cheered on the platform. Approximately 1,500 people, both black and white, had made their way into the athletic hall rented for the occasion. Railton would remember for the rest of his life the way the three Shirleys led the singing of the African American spiritual, My Lord, what a morning, my Lord, what a morning, my Lord, what a morning, when the stars began to fall. That's it.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you, Warren. Um, Thank you for not only being here today, but for all the work and advocacy you do, for telling the stories of Black Salvationists. So God bless you in your ministry. I think with your lovely reading and singing voice, if it ever doesn't work out here, you could definitely read for Audible or something like that. You have a really nice reading voice.
Thank you.
No, seriously though, thank you so much. And a reminder for our watching and listening audience, February is Black History Month. So go and celebrate it by learning something new about the contributions of African Americans in your community. And thank you, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you all again in the next episode of Museum People. Take care.